Hi everyone, my name is Anne-Sofie and I'm here to present my presentation titled The More Than Human Relations of Transplanetary Imaginaries and Habitats, Questions on Nature in Off-Earth Worlds. And if we can get this to work. Oh, God. Right, and this presentation is loosely structured around my PhD research. I'm actually an interaction designer, but I'm also doing a PhD here at Newcastle University, where I'm focusing on examining potential relations and interactions between humans and microbes within the context of space habitats. And really, today's presentation will be of a more philosophical nature. Usually I do practice-based design research. And be questioning, and is loosely structured around an interview I did with an environmental philosopher in relation to my PhD research. And it's actually going to focus on some questions that we've had already. First of all, yesterday during the amazing panel session, and also I believe Angelo just briefly also mentioned the topics that relate to my presentation. And I'll get to that now, which is I'm going to be talking about the construction of nature in outer space habitats. And as my point of departure for this, I'm going to be looking at sort of the imaginaries or the visions of the future that are present in the work of space theorist Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, and draw some parallels to sort of visions of today. And really what I want to achieve really is to trigger reflections and for you to ask questions about what nature could be in space. Let's get started. Right. So for most of the 20th century, physics and engineering sort of really ruled the waves. And that is, of course, no exception when it comes to the research and the innovation of the space race and the space age. And as we've sort of creeped into the 21st century, biology is slowly becoming part of these processes of technological innovations and in facilitating fusion, visions of the future. And of course, this symposium is an example of that. But the idea of biological systems within space habitat isn't a new one. We can actually trace it far back. And within formal research, we can trace it back to as early as the beginning of the 20th century, within the research of Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, which I will get to in a moment. But this, of course, has been considered science fiction for a very long time. And now we're slowly seeing how technological innovation is leading science fiction to become science fact, with projects such as the Melissa plant, which Angelo just briefly in depth described, as well as the Lunar Base 1, both projects that are inspired by Earth's biosphere to create these ideas of artificially closed ecosystems to autonomously recycle waste. But as I mentioned, some of the earliest formal space research involving biological systems can be found within the work of Konstantin Tsiolkovsky. And he was a very prolific theorist, and also referred to as the grandfather of space research, really, or at least Soviet space research. And he was very active in the late 19th century and 20th century. And of course, he's well known for his scientific contributions, such as the Tsiolkovsky rocketry equation, which proved the theoretical basis of spaceflight. But he's also somewhat known for his more philosophical musings on humankind's role in the universe. And but important for this presentation is that he was the first one to consider the possibility of establishing greenhouses in space. And of course, these greenhouses weren't just for show. They were there to recycle waste and provide a breathable atmosphere, as well as providing food for its human inhabitants. And in many of his manuscripts, you'll find these very interesting sketches where he sort of imagines how life would be in these conical habitat module shapes. And it becomes evident that when humans are supposed to settle in space, that also means a radical change in humankind's relationship to the natural world. Actually, Tsiolkovsky space and space technology promised a radical transformation of how we interact with nature, because it allowed us for pure and absolute biological and environmental control. As he writes in many of his manuscripts, he refers to really the natural world as an enemy. He says, in the ethereal space, there are no such enemies. And with enemies, he kind of loosely referred to just sort of, bugs and insects that were considered pests in his idea and in his sort of, creating these greenhouses. So in space, there is this notion, Tsiolkovsky, that there is a technofix. We can create these technologically enabled utopias where the elements that the natural world imposes on us, they don't exist. And so Tsiolkovsky, these technologically enabled utopias then facilitated very specific ways of living and interacting with the natural world. And it created this idea that it was to be harnessed and really transformed into largely serving as a means to ensure human survival in space. And Tsiolkovsky was so fascinated by this idea that he actually believed that seeing as now we have achieved such a possibility in space, we should also apply that to Earth. So he takes it to a rather extreme level, this transformation of our relationship with nature. He talks of, on Earth, about the complete annihilation of animals and plants that he describes as pests or defective or useless, really. And so there is this complete remaking of the environment in which only the plants and the varieties of non-human life, nature, that are left to survive and thrive are those that are actually deemed beneficial to us. So through what can be considered an almost religious and maybe naive belief in the power and the practice of science and technology, Tsiolkovsky saw for the greater good of humankind that we should be able to control the environment to that extent and remake nature to exist and have value only based on its sort of instrumental value, so its usefulness to us. And what emerges are very distinct borders then, when you look at it, between the human and the non-human world, and strong dichotomies such as what is considered desirable life and what is considered undesirable life. And that defines the nature that we bring with us into space. But it also defines how we know and how we relate to our environment. And so, of course, this is a highly human-centric approach to space, to nature, and to the non-human world. And it engenders hierarchical and some would argue problematic definitions of and constructions of nature in space, in which the natural world is subordinated, really, and is to be tamed and is in somehow separate from us because it really is beneath, or like it is beneath us in the hierarchy of living beings. So this specific distinction between that which is considered chaotic and uncontrollable and nature, and the orderly control that space technology brings with it, that we see very evidently in the work of Tsiolkovsky, brings with it very strong ties and the vocabulary of course, imperial colonialism, in which humankind were kind of envisioned as this conquering, this organized, force of being that went in and conquered and put order into the chaos and the unknown and the dangerous wilderness. So these are some of the sort of the themes that emerge when you read a lot of Tsiolkovsky's original work. But of course, Tsiolkovsky lived in a world very different from our own over 100 years ago. But I thought then, could ideas similar to his be latent in our way of thinking and imagining life in space? Well, while I don't know of anyone who goes around saying that we should actually annihilate complete segments of the natural world, I think perhaps we can think that we can discern emergent traits and parallels that we may draw from bias, some of Zukovsky's way of thinking, as well in the work of some of the work of today. Because, well, superficially, when we look to imagine biological systems as part of our future in space today, they're largely based and evaluated on their calculability, of course, and on the traits that are going to facilitate space travel and habitation. And so whether that really involves creating an artificial biosphere in which we define and control every aspect of the living to sustain humans, or we find some way of utilizing bacteria to acquire resources or modify our DNA so that we may survive. This is, again, of course, a human-centric approach to the construction of nature and space, because it is based in the idea of how do we, of course, shape them to facilitate our own needs and desires. However, as another researcher who looked into a similar topic, Schmidl argues, but one can also identify within these narratives, such as the Biosphere 2 project, which I'll discuss in a moment, are narratives that focus on simulations of naturalness through actually restricting, regulating, and controlling nature. For example, the Biosphere 2 project, which I'm sure probably a lot of people in here are aware of. And this, of course, involved creating a closed artificial ecological system to support and maintain humans in space. And this closed system was, of course, based around Earth's image and its biosphere. And at one point, it even housed 4,000 species of plants and animals. And I believe there was even a swamp, agricultural plots, a coral reef, and many more other elements. And of course, the mission was aimed at really making sure that 8 human inhabitants could stay alive without any influence from the outside, other than energy, of course, which they, of course, did for almost 2 years until a rogue sort of oxygen consuming bacteria sort of put a spanner in the works. And there's a lot of things that you can say about this project, but what it again simplifies, as Schmidl argues, is to this attempt to tame and control nature, predicts its behavior, and adapt nature to the needs of space exploration research, which, of course, in this case, it proved unpredictable and too complex. It reveals a desire to exclude the messy, the complex, and unruly nature of biological systems, and a desire to make them orderly, predictable through our technological interventions, more aligned with our fantasies of control than facilitating living and thinking with the non-living entities that inhabit them. If we only facilitate narratives of futures in space that render the more than human natural world entirely as an object to be evaluated or included based on its instrumental value or financial value, how do we make sure that we do not perpetuate a singular and dominating narrative of what nature should be, based on perhaps even colonialist ideas that are latent in our way of relating to the world? So colonialist ideas of reductionism, exploitation, or control of the non-human world. This begs the question, or really the questions. What then is nature in the context of off-Earth habitats? And seeing as the construction of nature is wholly man-made, what do we really want it to be? What is humankind's relation to the more than human natural world when we go into space? These are overarching questions that we should ask ourselves, so that we do not foster narratives of domination and exclusion, because the worlds that we build and imagine and design today are, of course, the infrastructures and built environments of tomorrow. Rather than to build worlds of hierarchical and dichotomous groupings, such as us and them, human, non-human, desirable and undesirable, how do we make a world that includes the radical complexity of being part of this world, embracing different ways of knowing and perceiving the world, or what Anna Haraway would call tentacular thinking? Embracing different ways of knowing and perceiving the world are essential to critically examining and interrogating futures so that we may create a more just future, not just a future that fits the ideologies or visions of the specific few. Therefore, we always have the responsibility to challenge assumptions about humankind's relation to their surrounding world, rather than leaving them tacitly part of the narratives about our future. So I will end the presentation today with, what is your vision of nature in space? Thinking about thinking with nature beyond the purely human-centered requires a recalibration of our ways of knowing and making sense of the world. Tentacular thinking opens to thinking with nature, to possibilities that allow for multi-species perspectives to take part in the formation of knowledge and our shared future in space. The question remains, do we perpetuate Tsiolkovsky's ideas of domination and control, good and bad, as we go into space? Is our desire to attempt to perpetuate Earth's life story in all its complexity? Or do we seek to improve upon it, remake it in our own desired image? These are questions that I believe we should all bear in mind when we talk about nature in space. Thank you. This is my literature list, if anyone's interested. Right. I guess if anyone have any questions or comments? Do we have time for that? Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I could have phrased that better. So I'm always struggling with the use of terms like with nature and so on, because aren't we just part of nature? So I feel like we just need to gain a deep understanding of actually being part of it. So this question sort of, what is your vision of us and the rest of the ecosystem with us? Or no, that was, so I guess I don't quite understand your question, I think.
I guess the question that I'm asking is basically just, I want to pique people's imagination so that we can get a critical understanding and a critical inquiry before these infrastructures are laid. And there are narratives that you could say that sort of create this sort of distance between this idea that we're part of nature, or that is what sort of a lot of theoretical interpretations have a stand on that. And I guess I just want to ask people, yeah, I just want to spur your imagination.
Angela has a question first.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. I'm definitely going to look into this reference list that you presented. Reflecting on the idea of nature as humans wanting nature to be orderly and predictable. It's very interesting because actually the two are very different. So I think even if nature does things, an ecosystem does things that is completely, unexpected, it is still orderly. It is always orderly, but it's not necessarily predictable. And the orderly aspect of nature it's just a way how you define order, of course, but I wouldn't compound order with simplicity. Basically what happens with ecosystems is they're complex systems with lots of feedback loops. So that's why, behavior with non-linearity behavior can be a little bit difficult to grasp at first. On top of that, you add a little bit of chaos into the mix, and there you go. Your ecosystem is doing things that you didn't expect it to do. But the important thing is, it's always highly deterministic. So it's in this way, there is order. Because once the ecosystem has done its thing, you can really trace back every single step what happened along the way. So it's always compared with simulating the movement of a flag in the wind, the soft textile that's moving in the flag. you can't really predict the next position of the flag with all the wrinkles and everything. But once it's done that, you can actually calculate back where it came from. And that's really the beauty of chaos. Chaos is deterministic. So there is a sort of order there, but it's unpredictable, right? So it's interesting to make a bit of a distinction between those two. Because some people start thinking like it's random, you know. It's actually not random. That I think that's the main point here.
You want to react?
Thank you so much. That's a really fascinating input. I guess I was also using sort of what's it called vocabulary that I found originally in sort of the work of Ziolkowski, and a lot of sort of descriptions that you see around the descriptions of nature and the description of humankind's, you know, intention when we use technology and create these technological interventions in these sort of contexts. But thank you. That was.
I think maybe in general, in the context here, it would be interesting for us to look more into the post-normal way of thinking, post-normal science. That really is what I just talked about. And Tsiolkovsky obviously was not living in post-normal times, but now we're embracing a post-normal science, which is all about complexity. And there is a lot of misunderstanding within that domain. I mean, and for a more general public as well. Yeah.
Can I ask a quick question? Because you're telling us you want to us to think about these questions while we're thinking about going into space, for example, or in our research. When should we ask ourselves these questions? Is it throughout the whole process? Are we asking ourselves the same questions? How would you see us do that? Because you said, oh, I want you to ask the questions before you think about imagining futures.
Thank you for your question. I think this is something that it's a constant process of reflection. Just like when you're a designer, that's always a reflective process that you have with the materials that you make. And you should always sort of, I think, embed that as part of like the sort of the diverse perspectives and like ramifications of your research. But yeah.
I think we have time and then.
What is your vision of evolution in space?
Well, that's a very significant question. Well, I think there's like a sort of a symbiotic where we're going to live with technology in space because we're going to have to adapt to the environments in space. And so that kind of opens to new and very speculative interactions with more than human life forms. I mean, we're even currently looking into how we can sort of modify our DNA with tardigrade DNA to make ourselves more resilient to the environments of space. So I think there's like a sort of a flux and that'll go with like because a lot of like also all researchers were looking at how we're going to become this new form of human. I mean, there's a lot of people who talk about post-biological, post-human. Isaac Asimov talked about this idea of a G-man, which would be a form of humankind who had, you know, adapted and evolved to be able to live in low gravity environments. So, I mean, yeah, it's something that we don't know and we can't really. And there's a lot of things we don't know about space and how we react to space environments, but it's definitely going to be interesting. Right. Okay. I think we're moving on now to Brian Degger with his presentation on artistic research within the biofutures for transplanetary habitats. Everyone give Brian a standing ovation.
Hi, I'm Brian Degger. I'm interested in talking about artistic research within the biofutures, specifically transplanetary. Myself, I'm a researcher, a biologist, and an artist. I work with microcosms. For example, here we have me working with an organism called Daphnia, and I wanted to make a kit that made it accessible to the general public to have like a window microcosm where they could watch Daphnia in the same way as like I guess that one. Rhim shrimps. So in this, I use Do It With Others and DIY Biology. I sort of do what could be seen as experimental or performative biology. And by this, I mean researching subjects turning to art workshops, performances, meals, using approaches such as the construction of artistic wet labs, hacking electronics in order to deconstruct scientific practices. And this also leads me to be interested in elucidating how other artists do this, as well as participating in research residencies together with groups like Hacteria, Finnish BioArt Society, MadLab, and the Arts Catalyst Lighthouse Arts. My formal education is in molecular biology and biotech with honours and PhD looking at fish growth factors. So the role of the artist researchers, artists are able to learn what there is to learn, but also be willing to follow unpopular lines of inquiry. So this is a quote by Stephen Wilson, who during his art practice decided that it was important for him to know how a radio worked. So he built his own radio, which was slightly unpopular with the fine artist academics. But he follows a long line of people where we want to know where the technology comes from. And these, once you know how technology works, you can use these processes. Briefly, artists appear to do this by setting the question for investigations. A point of departure from the sciences is that often the questions asked are whimsical or absurd, or rather than utilitarian. This even being said, that artists can ask questions forbidden to scientists. These artists then access scientific methodologies through lab building, residencies in scientific facilities, and collaborations for the construction of technological artifacts to generate an aesthetic object or experience. In this presentation, we'll very briefly look at three artworks that are their core idea: non-human entities, non-terrestrial environments, and our relationship with them. Agnes Meyer-Brandis's Moon Goose Analog looked at this idea of geese that would fly to the moon based on a very early science fiction story. And her practice can be contextualized as, I guess, poetic scientific fairy tales. Previous works have had such things as apparatuses looking for fairies in soil core samples and probing icebergs beneath ice rinks. Moon Goose Analog took as an inspiration early science fiction Man in the Moon by Francis Goodwin, in which a man harnessed geese to take him to the moon to escape punishment. In order to do this, she raised and trained a flock of 11 geese from birth, acting as a goose mother in a moon analog facility that was built in Palara, Italy, in which they could be adapted for the journey to the moon and subsequently living there. The exhibition contained a video link from the control tower in the art exhibition to the facility, as well as videos of the training. Andy Gracie's Drosophila titanus took as an inspiration discoveries on the composition of Saturn and Moon Titan's atmosphere and gravity by Cassini-Huygens probe. And he postulated it would be possible for humans to fly unaided, although environmental conditions were very harsh, with sub-zero temperatures and methane rain. However, it might be possible to adapt to the conditions with the right apparatus. And he used the fruit fly Drosophila, as it was already a scientific model organism that has been used in space travel. And he thought, was trying to address, would it be possible to eventually breed a flightless variety capable of living on Titan? How does one construct an artificial environment on Earth using DIY improv methodologies. And I guess, when you decide to hold the experiment, when you decide to publish, exhibit, etc. The work can interrogate both the over-optimism of traveling off-world and the possible future of parts of the Earth becoming uninhabitable due to climate change. The halting for Gracie came when the air conditioning failed one weekend and all the flies, after 140 generations, died. Whilst it might be possible to rescue the flies, it also seemed appropriate to stop there. So he sort of exhibited as preserved flies and the apparatus. Casa Mulga's How to Make an Ocean grew out of a period of grief and a wish to see whether human tears could support an ecosystem. So she's interested in decentering the human. So, she relates that during a period devastating loss in 2019, the artist cried many tears during this time, and while dealing with grief, at one point started to collect them in a small container. She also discovered a prompt in The Flights, a book by Olga Tkaczarek, where the protagonist dreamt of an instruction manual how to make an ocean in 4 steps. It struck a chord with the artist as they spent their childhood in the open ocean. They lived by the sea, and the sea is a huge part of their life. With so many tears, they started to wonder whether it's possible to cultivate some marine life in them, to make some life affirming that was in a way to deal with devastating loss, not only personal or caused by the pandemic, but also the environmental grief that's coming. How to Make an Ocean is their journey through the past 18 months, and it's an experience of a narrative in a form of multifaceted facade installation in which the audience is invited to look at the collection of tears and life present in them, and also in which willing participants, with the aid of an artificial intelligent morologist or what we'd say a professional mariner bot, are invited to try to shed some tears so that they too contribute to the growth of mini oceans. It's our old adage, art and science being separate endeavors. However, writers of science fiction saw that literature could affect technoscience, warn against utopic or dystopic theory thinking, and at least make it more understandable to the general public. In a similar way, media artists make tractable the complexities of modern science by doing the heavy lifting of immersing themselves in logic, language, and technology of science. In order to make artists, Kasia Mulliga described the importance of being an outsider to see the interconnections between domains that specialists don't see and be able to mesh them. Despite the advent of actual space travel and exploration, artists such as these serve to remind us that the cosmos is still a place for wonder, disquiet, and poetic imaginings. To counter the narrative where space is neatly packed up,
Maria will be talking to us about evoking the feeling of home in extreme environments through synesthetic design.
Hello, my name is Maria and I'm a designer. I have a background in industrial design, social design and speculative design. And I'm very happy to be able to present my recent research evoking the feeling of home in extreme environments through synesthetic design. As we prepare for a one-way mission to Mars and we search for optimal solutions for body resilience and perseverance, for sustainable energy solutions, way to transport people and build habitats, I asked myself a question: isn't it also important to make this habitat feel like home? Connecting with the data that shows how crew well-being is essential for their efficiency and avoiding errors in crew well-being, creating this environment which would feel safe and comfortable seems to be an essential factor for creating, especially long-term, in consideration long-term space missions, but also considering creating environments for submarine missions or habitats on the Arctic. So building on knowledge that we get from space on Earth and vice versa. A quick overview of the methodology that I used. Besides scientific methods, I will go more into the methods that design research provides us, and I'll be talking a little bit more about speculative design and its power. So a little bit about the relation between different extreme environments, considering space, the pandemic, COVID-19, and extreme environments, looking into how people in extreme environments have been isolated for a longer period of time, usually in a sterile environment, whether it's somewhere on a submarine or on the ISS or on the Arctic. And a lot of us experienced a similar situation during the COVID pandemic, where we suddenly got ourselves enforced in staying in one space, working, sleeping, and actually living in this one space all the time, creating the topic of home and well-being a little bit more relevant and relatable. The similarities that I focus on in this project is enforced isolation, sensory deprivation, and the change of meaning of home. So where do senses fit in all of this? As humans, we discovered the world through senses. We develop memories and emotional bonds through touch, smell, sight, taste, and sound from the very first days. Seemingly invisible, yet these tiny details have great impact on how we experience the world. But in these extreme environments, there are visible limitations when it comes to natural smells and sounds. Comparing, for example, smell, due to microgravity, there's a visible loss of the sense of smell, and a lot of people also had the loss of sense of smell due to COVID, which was an interesting comparison to look into. When it comes to synesthetic design, Jędryszek Lee's theory of 5 senses states that products and experiences that involve more senses are more memorable and better. So for example, that's why sex is great, because it can involve all senses. And the power of senses, especially in architecture and spatial design, has been researched since the 90s. There was a Finnish designer, Palasma, who looked into senses in architecture, and more recently a Polish architect, Joanna Jurga, looking into the sense of security in spaces also involving senses. As mentioned, the feeling of home is extremely important. The sense of familiarity and comfort and safety, the memories that where we grew up and connect to home, is closely linked to our sense of identity and well-being. But then I asked myself a question: what actually makes a place a home? And how do we connect that to senses? And that's where design methods come in handy. In this research, I involved a whole group of people from all sorts of countries and all different types of backgrounds. And I grouped them in 4 different categories. So analog astronauts, a group of astronauts that participated in different analog missions, and also a group that I participated with. Then participants that were isolated due to COVID-19, different analog environments such as submarine missions, and also international students. During this project, I conducted a series of different co-creation workshops and distributing probes. So I'm just going to talk about a few examples because I don't have time to talk about all of them. But this one in particular was a probe designed to compare and explore the meaning of home in relation to students that went to celebrate Christmas to their home countries, and students that could not go back home for Christmas and had to stay in isolation and go through the holidays in isolation. And even though there was only one chapter that was dedicated to food, actually each participant mentioned a dish that was a holiday must, or something that they connected to home, something that they missed, something that they connected to the celebration in almost every chapter, which is very interesting. And all these booklets were actually filled with senses. And after collecting the booklets, I also asked my participants to map out experiences and objects or people that they connected to home through the 5 senses. And I could see that all these objects were actually greatly involving more than 3 senses. Another co-creation that I did involved artifact making through various materials as a tool of facilitating a conversation. And I asked my participants to imagine a scenario where they would go on a one-way mission into space, and they could create an artifact, a memory capsule to take home with them. And I set out, there were absolutely no limitations in here. So we could use different materials, but also imagine absolutely wild scenarios. You could shrink your whole family into a little bubble. You could put in a hug. There were absolutely no limits in here. The interesting thing here was that senses were not included in the task. I said nothing about senses, yet every single object, every single artifact actually involved multiple senses. And that sensory experience was the storyteller of the emotional bonds in the home memory. In May, I took part in an analog mission myself in the Lunaris research station in Poland, where I spent half a month in isolation with no sunlight. We didn't go outside at all. Yeah, no fresh air, a freeze-dried food diet, a lot of research, a lot of medical data. We collected psychological, sociological, and medical data for myself and 5 other crew members they participated with. And I'm just gonna talk about the sensory and the home experiments, since the data we collected is enormous. But the observation on senses, besides the memory capsules that we created as well, we had this co-creation sessions where we discussed what is home before the mission, during the mission, and after the mission. And I also asked them to keep a sensory journal where they would document sensory phenomena during the mission, and then document their surrounding. How did they describe the surrounding in the habitat and outside the habitat before the mission and after the mission? And it was very interesting that the documentation actually showed how different senses react to these extreme environments and in isolation, how individual it actually is. Everybody had a different sensory phenomena during the mission itself. But you could see that some senses strengthened, some senses weakened, but there was clearly a longing for that sensory stimulation during the mission. The very interesting thing was that after 2 weeks of isolation, after coming out, your senses expand so drastically and the world becomes so incredibly saturated and vibrant. And that was also an observation that I heard from the submarine crew. So while collecting all this empirical data, what I realized that even if an object was connected to home, it wasn't solely the object, but actually the whole story behind it. It was the object, but also its smell, its tactility, its sound, its taste. What was very interesting was that the sensory home of all my participants was actually a childhood memory. And even though when I asked them what is home, I had different answers from a physical location to something more metaphorical or emotional, a space that had specific traits. There was always the repetitiveness of comfort, safety, and belonging. But when we talked about the sensory home, the smell of home, the sound of home, the sense of home, it was always going back to a childhood memory, somewhere that we grew up in, something that was a happy memory, somewhere that shaped our identity, something that was inconvertible and emotionally palpable. So at the end, we created these artifacts, these little speculative memory capsules for each participant. And here are 4 examples. So how it works, the first one is the synesthetic light map, which you can zoom in and out to smell the live surrounding of the location. And you can touch the grass, you can hear your mother's voice, you can pet your tiny dog real time live on the map. And it's small, it's portable. You can take it in your pocket. The second one is the love blob, which you place on your heart to spread the feeling of love, because for this participant, home was love. And then there's the olfactory soundscapes, which evoke the feeling of home through playing the sounds and evoking the smell of home simultaneously. And the shell of smell, which senses which feeling of home would you like to recreate, and you can smell the sea or hear the crickets and feel the warm summer night. And these artifacts are the story of people's homes, and they're trying to recreate that sensory feeling of home in extreme environments. Design is often perceived as only problem solving, a form and a function, but the power of design actually reaches beyond fixing the now. Design can discuss the present, comment on the past, and help dream of an alternative future, hoping for a better one. Speculating these scenarios seemingly so distant from reality, suddenly come to life through these artifacts, become more palpable. They can unravel mysteries about ourselves. They can create awareness of potential risks, open imaginations of alternative ways of being. And by inviting people into these speculations and speculative universes, we can create more inclusive futures. So throughout my research, I asked my participants how they actually felt while describing their homes while being so far away. And almost everybody said that it was a positive experience, and that it was an incentive to think about the good memories and realize how much one can be grateful for. The possibilities of actually speculating, how can we bring something so close to one's heart, was very heartwarming and hopeful. As we often discard the smallest details, the smallest elements, but these details sometimes matter greatly. Sometimes, yeah, the space is such a complex environment, but sometimes it's a batch, the smell of freshly baked cookies that actually bring us home in this cosmic maze. So, thank you.
we're running a bit late, so if just a few questions. Thank you so much, Maria. Yeah, there we go. Right.
Thank you so much. That was a wonderful presentation, and I think it's possibly more a comment than a question, but something that you said at the end about the conversations being helpful for people as almost as much as anything else, I think is also a really important outcome, in the sense that the objects themselves, wonderful though they might be, the opportunity for people to use their imaginations in that way is also a really rich outcome from your work. So I just wanted to reflect on that. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for your presentation. Of course, we already discussed the experience of analog missions. We've both been through it. How would you? I'm interested in the idea of creating a device that brings you back to something outside of the mission, basically, with the idea of home. How quickly do you think that it affects fate? Because that's the thing. What happens to me when there's a particular smell that reminds me of something. In the beginning, I'm like almost shocked, like, oh my God, that reminds me of this. And then if I keep smelling it, at a certain point, the association is fading and it's gone and I can't grasp it anymore. Do you account for that? That maybe it only will work a couple of times and then the artifact doesn't have that intended effect any longer?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Thank you. Yeah, I think that it really depends. These artifacts are more to trigger the conversation and imagination. So of course, like the technology behind it is still non-existent. You can't really shrink a dog, unfortunately. But I think that it's always like, if you have like a little postcard or maybe a photo of your family that you take on your travels. Of course, it's something that you remember how your family looks like, right? And you don't have to constantly look at the photo of your family to remember how they look like. But it's like this kind of sentimental artifact that you might maybe hide under your bed, and in times of, I don't know, grief, or maybe you need like some kind of stimulation, it can be something that will bring you back home. It's not something that maybe you'd use every single day, but just having the feeling that you can go back, or you can have this reminder, maybe is more of a hopeful message as well.
Just hearing you talk reminds me of something that we observed during our mission. We started to notice that everybody in the mission, in the high seas mission that I participated in, we had these different strategies to escape. There were a couple of people that were playing computer games. I was one of them in the evening, just, with some headset, and then you're out of the habitat. There were people that were intensively planning and thinking about the travel they were going to make after the mission. That's another way of, putting yourself into a different kind of space. And interestingly, and this really connects with what you were presenting, 2 of our crew members started listening to music they were listening to when they were like young teenagers. And also probably in an attempt to escape the experience, not because it's such a horrible experience, but to balance things. So I wonder if it's really home you're looking for, or it's a safe space that disconnects you for a little bit. And for some people it can be home, but for other people it could be a computer game, or it could be another kind of experience, just to stay sane during this very intense experience. It's more like an observation. It's not really a question, but it resonates very much with what we were just describing.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think that also, like, the fact that how closely we connect the feeling of home with something that is very safe, and it doesn't have to be the physical location of a house to feel like home. So that's the different ways of like
getting away into this kind of comfort zone is very important. And like the 4 artifacts that I showed were just examples, but since I had a huge amount of participants, everybody had their own little memory capsule, and they were so different. It came from some kind of doors that went through different dimensions. And there was one participant who actually wanted to have, it was actually very interesting because even though she said that she does not smoke, but she has this one bar that she'd like to go to or like have some kind of hologram where she could also feel the smell of smoke because all her friends smoke. And that was such a familiar thing that she felt like home, even though it wasn't, it's not healthy. But yeah, so like these little details as well that that really matter greatly.
Right, thank you. Everyone, let's hand of applause. Round of applause. Right. Our next speaker will join us via Zoom. The next presenters are Manuela Mehrwald and Anna Pomyalova. Both are pre-doctoral fellows, one with the University of Duisburg and Essen and University of Heinrich-Heine. They'll be talking to us about facing the ground, ecological thinking in the post-Anthropocene on the example of the artist Rhim Lee internal burial suit.
Yeah, thank you very much for having us. My colleague Anna and I, we're joining from Germany, and yeah, we feel very inspired by all the great presentations we have listened to so far. Although we have to admit that it's quite challenging for us to follow all the scientific steps as artistic researchers. Nevertheless, your ideas and the images your researchers create are highly inspiring to us. So we will start with a quote by Donna Haraway. It matters what thoughts think thoughts. It matters what knowledges know knowledges. It matters what relations relate relations. It matters what worlds world worlds. It matters what stories tell stories. We need to face the ground and start to tell different kinds of stories. Contemporary thinkers such as Donna Haraway and Anna Löwenhaupt-Singh started these stories by shaping new materialist discourse in the humanities in recent decades, arguing against anthropocentrism. They argument that living things throughout evolutionary history construct themselves in mutual co-becoming. Likewise, humans are conceived as open, porous entities in constant exchange with their environment. So Anna and I started to collaborate last year during the project Living with Ruins. I've been invited to this project by the artist Jakob Engel and the architect Arthur de Bourén, and together we were thinking about what the theater of the Anthropocene could look like. The theater Studio Naxos in Frankfurt in Germany is actually a disused industrial hall from pre-war, saturated with heavy metal oils. And our contribution to this runic place was to decontaminate and revitalize this place with the help of plants and mushrooms, as you can see here in the rendering on the right side, and the picture we showed you before. So this was our contribution. Anna and my theoretical contribution to this project were dedicated to the question in how far is human in general and the body in particular part of this contaminated soil, and how does it influence our social localization as humans? The work you can see here is the painting made by the American artist Shoshana Dubina. It is called Ligon Playground and refers to a quote by the biologists Lynn Margulis and Dorian Sagan. It says, "So what is life? Life is planetary exuberance, the transmutation of Earth's air, water, and sun into cells. It is matter gone wild." During our collaboration, we realized that what fascinates us most about the discourse on new materialism is the shift in perspective, away from my own human position to a polycentric view and the complexity of connections developing in relational becoming, to say it in the words of the sociologist Kerstin Meissner. But despite this idea of relational becoming and its accompanying enthusiasm for creating futures, we realize that no one wants to deal with the loss during this process. The waste comes back, and with it come heavy metals, hormones, microplastics, and antibiotics, as Yvonne Volkart points out. This is what we have to deal with. So it might seem harsh to think of the human body as waste, but in the end, it's the material the human leaves behind when it passes. So we have to ask ourselves, what happens with our bodies when they die, and what is their part in the ecological balance production? How can we talk about it? Again, we say we need different kinds of stories. As artistic researchers, we are convinced that artists are among the most innovative storytellers in our society. They have their ideas of temporality and speciality, and their particular social position places them between collective trauma processing, social needs, and yearning for optimism. We can use these characteristics to unlearn our anthropocentric ways of thinking and acting and develop new strategies that can be helpful for healing the earth as well as preparing for life in extreme environments. So Anna will tell you now more about how to do so by establishing a symbiocentric perspective. Firstly, by demonstrating to you the socio-cultural models of Haraway and Singh, and secondly, by analyzing the design piece Infinity Burial Suit by Rhim Lee, an ecological burial inspired by the environmental role of mushrooms in balanced production, a model that we understand as a symbol for an ecological rethinking and a renewal of relations between human and non-human.
Hello, everyone. Yes. You can just show the next picture. Thank you. This is another picture by Shoshana Dubina. We would like to show you. This picture is from the chapter Symposium, From Staying with the Trouble by Donna Haraway. While looking at the picture, I will read you a quote from this chapter. Yes, this one. Critters interpenetrate one another, loop around and through one another, eat each other, get indigestion, and partially digest and partially assimilate one another, and thereby establish symbiotic arrangements that are otherwise known as cells, organisms, and ecological assemblages. Those living beings construct themselves in mutual co-becoming, called the symbiotic principle. Symbiosis can be translated as making together. The latest research in development biology, epigenetic, and microbial studies has shown that species have emerged through interaction with each other. The exchange between species has been an essential driving force of evolution. You can see that no organism lives in total purity. Everything exists in multi-species assemblages. To show that there is no isolated life, we need, according to Donna Haraway, other kinds of stories. In the Anthropocene, stories are told differently, in networks with more than human world. And art provides a deeper understanding of the world's interconnectedness. There are different kinds of art practices. Shoshana Dubina's paintings are an example for the illustration of the theories around the new materialism. Others, like bioartists, intervene directly in living matter. In making bonds between species, post-humanists, thinkers, and Donna Haraway herself simultaneously see hope for survival in the crisis of the Anthropocene. In symbiotic interconnection with the environment, Haraway draws an arc from the vital to the social, a descriptive model for the world of networked living beings. Haraway, as well as Anna Singh, plead against anthropocentrism. Instead of exit strategies, they propose collaborative survival and a model of co-becoming and co-dying. So as decomposers of that matter, fungi are irreplaceable actors in these cycles of transformation. Microremediation means soil remediation from Greek fungus and balance production. And according to Anna Zink, you can see fungi are these world builders shaping environments for themselves and others. Because the mycelium feeds on organic waste and decomposes toxic waste such as petroleum, digesting it with the help of their extracellular enzymes. This is why they are actively used for soil decontamination. Yes, and during her artistic research, biodesigner Rhim was confronted with shocking facts from the US Center for Disease Control. Around 219 toxins, such as tobacco residues, heavy metals, cleaning agents, pesticides, and much more are released from the human body into the environment during a funeral. And during a cremation, about 50 kilos of CO2. So the idea of the designer was to invite an ecological form of burial. Her work raises questions about dealing with death and how design can restore our environment. Lee created a special suit from cotton. The lining consists of a gel layer, a nutrient medium, and capsules from fungal spores that are put on like a second skin. After death, the fungus digests the toxins excreted from the body. This promotes decomposition by other microorganisms and further composting. Infinity burial suit is a symbol for the thinking and renewal of relations between human and non-human. Human does not come from homo, but humus, says Haraway in her Ecological Ethics. The mushroom suit demonstrates humans are part of a complex system. We are involved in the performance of the living and dying. It is about a relational self-understanding that is essential for the survival of our entire culture. Belonging to the world is not curable, but if you make an effort, you can cure yourself of the belief that you don't belong. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
All right, can you hear me? All right. All right.
Yes.
Thank you so much for such a fascinating presentation. We will now be taking any questions. We'll start with any from the room. Yes, hang on, we've got one here.
Thank you so much, both of you. Oops, I got. So this is less of a question than an input. I wonder if you've heard of the coffin made from mycelium that is now being produced in the Netherlands. I believe they're called Loop, and they have built their startup concept, their business concept, upon this mycelium suit. So yeah, just wanted to share that, and thank you for a really great presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, it is maybe a much more, it is something else like a suit. Yes, the other project from Netherlands, it's like more natural. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Any other questions? Yeah.
The question is how post-Anthropocene is different, if at all, from the post-human?
Can you say that again? It was quite hard to understand.
How post-Anthropocene is different, if at all, from the post-human?
I'm not sure if I really get the question. Perhaps you can explain it a bit more.
It's from an online audience, but I think they want to know how post-Anthropocene is different from post-human, or whether they're similar.
Yeah, well, actually, they're similar. It's basically, it's basically from the social perspective, I think.
Yes, it is inside of posthumanism. So posthumanism is a huge umbrella term. And you have also transhumanism, posthumanism, and a kind of discourse is post-Anthropocentrism. So it is a first step in these artistic projects to articulate a posthumanistic strategy by Überwindung des Menschen.
By overcoming the human. Yeah. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think it was a question from the chat, and I think
okay.
we should say that you definitely did. Great answer, they said.
Okay.
All right, I think actually, if there aren't any other questions, all right, hang on.
Hi, yeah, this is Angela. I gave a presentation before, specifically talking about Melissa, the bioregenerative ecosystem. And one of the notions that or the discoveries that I did by studying it is the idea that we are constantly exchanging molecules, and all the organisms are basically, including us, are just basically different spatial and energetic reconfigurations of the same building blocks. And I think with this whole burial suit, that becomes obvious. I mean, it's something, of course, it's nothing new, the idea that we're all made from the same stardust. But I think that might be a useful perspective as well. And it's specifically just looking at this image of a fungus growing on a body, and then just the exchange and reconfiguration of molecules might be an interesting way to look at it as well. Just more like a suggestion.
Yeah, thank you very much.
You.